Knowledge and information. This is the theme of this year's edition of Global Axess. The importance of knowledge has been evident to man since the beginning of time. But the information society presents new questions. How does the increasingly intense flow of information affect our ability to maintain a holistic understanding of the world? And does it actually make us smarter or dumber? Elisabeth Kendall is a doctor in Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford, specialising in Yemen. In this conversation with Niklas Ekdahl, she elaborates on the narratives that form the developments of the Middle East, including the changing use of propaganda by jihadists.
Ever since 9/11, there's been this narrative in the West about a war on terror, often translated into a military approach. When you look at Yemen in particular, where you do a lot of work, what do you make of the war metaphor and its fallout on the ground?
War is always a very problematic metaphor, but particularly when the metaphor actually turns into real life. The whole problem with the war on terror is that you can't kill ideas, you can only kill people. So it's unclear exactly what your war is about. What we really need is a much more sophisticated, well-rounded approach, which is not just kinetic, not just about military action, but that really gets to the heart of why terrorism exists, what underpins it, and what drives people to join it.
And you've made that case many times when you're a commentator on BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and so on. And when you look at this Western narrative in Western media, what do you think of the broader story about the Arab world, our take on the Arab world? Does it get too simplistic at times?
It does get too simplistic. It's very easy to be taken in by the images that we're constantly surrounded by, like women in veils and men with guns, and every broadcast about a news item in the Middle East starts with a call to prayer. Oddly enough, actually, where I travel in the Arab world, I am mostly surrounded by women in veils and men with guns, but that doesn't mean that that's the same from Morocco to Iraq and across North Africa. So yes, we do have a very simplistic image. And of course, part of the reason for that is that the thing that makes news is the violence and the conflict and the everyday, ordinary kaleidoscope of life in the Arab world does not make news.
But when you look at the political, diplomatic side of it, does these simplistic news angles, do they also translate into narrow-minded policy approaches, would you say?
I think that we do have narrow-minded policy approaches, although I wouldn't limit that to policy approaches to the Middle East or even to foreign policy. I think many policy approaches are narrow. But what I do think is that we're constantly reacting to situations and that we're not very proactive in our policies. So if we actually took a longer-term look at how we could be helpful in the Middle East, it might be more about trying to address the root causes of problems in society instead of always coming in to fix conflicts once they've started. And you have certainly tried to connect that humanitarian work that you do on the ground in Yemen to the strategic approach of the major powers. So what's the response there? Is there a growing understanding for the cultural complexities of the situation, or is it all about droning militants and stopping evil Iran and so on? It's a good question. It's not all about droning militants and stopping evil Iran, although that's a very large part of it. What I think happens is that we do have large government departments that are devoted to investing in just the kinds of things that I've mentioned, community projects that help address society's ills, but they work top down. They don't work bottom up, and they work often through very corrupt government structures, which means not only that money gets wasted, but that the projects that are undertaken are tainted in the eyes of those whom they're designed to reach. And often the bill is 10 times as much as it needs to be because so much money filters out along the way. What we really need to do is have projects that start in at a grassroots level and that really are modelled on existing local initiatives.
And you have good examples from Yemen in that regard, right?
I do.
Schools and the work you've been doing.
Yes, I've been trying to help with an education programme that gets into vulnerable communities in the east of Yemen. And it's not standard education, it's more about peace building and stability, and it helps kids to understand how to link actions to consequences, that kind of thing. And we also have quite a heavy focus on women and women's literacy. The problem is that for governments, this kind of grassroots project is difficult to control, and I normally get the same answer. It's too dangerous to work in these regions, it's too remote, we don't have any offices there, and it's too cheap. So it's not worth our while. And of course, that is precisely why and how terrorist and extremist groups get into these areas.
They fill the void when basic services aren't provided, right?
That's right. And just to follow up from your previous question, I think one area in which policy really could change would be in being a bit less risk-averse, taking some risks. And perhaps also having diplomats who can leave the embassy compound and get around the country and see what's going on. In Yemen in particular at the moment, we don't even have an embassy in Yemen. We're camped out in Riyadh. And even when we were in Yemen, it was armoured vehicles, wrapped in cotton wool, maybe you go to the UN and then the US embassy and then back to the UK embassy. How are you ever going to know what's going on?
Right. But speaking of risk, the American and British invasion of Iraq in 2003, that was a rather risky endeavor, you could say. And in doing away with the Sunni dictatorship there in Iraq, obviously the Iranians were emboldened in the region. And the Islamic State is part of the fallout, you could say, in Iraq and Syria. But if you look at Yemen, is the war in Yemen also part of the fallout of this Sunni-Shia rift that we've seen, or would that situation have emerged anyway in Yemen?
That's a very interesting question, and I think it's an angle that not many people have thought of. I think you're right. I think that the whole fallout of the Iraq war and the emboldening of Iran has got something to do with the current Yemen war, because it has helped to motivate Saudi and its Gulf allies into intervening in the war in Yemen in March 2015 in order partly to counter the influence of Iran, which it perceives, and there is some truth in this, to be backing materially and very vocally the Houthi rebels. But it is important to remember that ultimately the Yemen war is a domestically generated war. And it's a brilliant example of what we spoke about earlier in this interview, which is ignoring problems until they become conflicts. The Houthis in the north of Yemen have been marginalized over many decades. And they have been politically marginalised, economically marginalised, and not really involved in designing the new federal regions, which sparked their current march on the capital. So had these problems been addressed earlier, we might not be where we are.
And the Sunni paranoia, if you will, in countries like Saudi Arabia now concerning the Iranian influence in the region, that is the way you describe it, that it has sort of added another dimension to an already existing problem that should have been addressed a lot earlier, decades earlier.
Yes, I think so, because actually, even at the beginning of this war, the situation was not sectarian in Yemen. This was not a sectarian country of fighting between Sunnis and Shiites. It just wasn't like that. But what has happened is that it has become increasingly sectarian, and that the old struggles for power, territory, resources are now being framed in sectarian terms, added to by so much of the rhetoric coming out of the Gulf and Gulf countries.
And now with the jihadists on the back foot in Syria and Iraq, Yemen has become sort of a breeding ground for militants with the vacuum there. So how is Islamic State and Al-Qaeda operating to win the hearts and minds of the local population in Yemen?
Al-Qaeda was greatly emboldened, in particular, by the start of the war in Yemen. And it took advantage of the instability in the west of the country to take over a vast area of land in the east of the country. And it was helped in this by doing the kinds of projects I was talking about. Actually, 56% of Al-Qaeda's governance tweets were about community development projects. That is no longer the case in Yemen because it lost its state in April 2016, and it's now very much on the back foot. Doesn't mean the problem's gone away. It means it's fragmenting and it's not being able to coordinate well. I actually think that under the surface there are problems building in Yemen that in the future extremists might be able to latch onto again. And you mentioned also Islamic State. This has not been a major problem in Yemen yet. It has not been able to.
But they have a presence.
They have a presence. They do have a presence. They were heavily bombed by the Americans in October last year. Both of their training camps were hit. And they've not been able to build strong alliances with tribes, partly because they're so dictatorial and brutal. They just don't go down well in Yemen.
And you specialize in their media use and their narratives and so on. So if you look at these different organizations, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, how do they differ in their approach to the propaganda, if you will?
Islamic State does tend to produce much more slick, highly produced, impressive propaganda.
Westernized almost Hollywood-esque.
Yeah, right, exactly. Hollywood-esque style. That doesn't necessarily go down well locally, however. It impresses us. But it doesn't really grab people on the ground in Yemen in the same way. Al-Qaeda's more ramshackle, slightly earthy production has more of a resonance, I think, in many ways. Perhaps not some of its longer talking head videos. There's been a series by its leader, Qasem Araimi, which came out over 40 episodes.
He rambles on for hours.
Man, it's incredibly dull. So 40 episodes of him talking about a medieval war treatise by Al-Harthami. He doesn't really have much charisma. So that's not the kind of thing I'm thinking of. But when they film their operations and they're quite earthy, I think that's...
Yeah, and you also describe Al-Qaeda as a learning, evolving organization. What does that mean in terms of media use? Are they getting more savvy or...?
They are getting more savvy in adapting to changing circumstances on the ground. Part of that is that its large, bulky cultural periodicals that were its standard fare disappeared, really, with the Arab Spring, and it switched to a news bulletin format. That, again, started to disappear when the national dialogue and the subsequent unravelling of Yemen materialised. What Al-Qaeda then switched to was quite snappy video series, which were much more militant, much more sectarian. What I would say is that the whole social media side of it has not taken off that much in Yemen. It's always been about hard copies and about narratives which are oral. And even now, we don't see much on Facebook or Twitter, not just because they're not as big on that kind of media as in other places in the Arab world, but because they're taken down too quickly now. So it's all about internal chat on encrypted messaging apps.
Right. And this Al-Qaeda franchise in Yemen, it's very active, right?
Well, yes.
And how does their jihadi narrative relate to the bigger conflict, if you will, this strategic conflict between Iran on one side and Saudi, Israel, the US on the other? So
Al-Qaeda has been very active in Yemen. It's much less active in 2018.
Is it being played also by other powers, so to speak? Are Saudi Arabia trying to influence Al-Qaeda as a tool?
It's possible. What I would say is that Al-Qaeda has tried very hard to explain the current conflict in its own sectarian terms. Its arguments are difficult to make because it's trying to argue that America and its allies are backing the Houthis, whereas it's very obvious that they're not.
So the other way around.
But because they're all enemies, Iran is an enemy on one side, but Saudi and America and UAE are all enemies on the other side. So it has to try and find a way of explaining how all of these people are in the enemy mixing pot. One of the ways it's done that is by saying, okay, Iran might well say death to Israel, death to America, but look, it signed the UN Charter, so therefore it approves of Israel, which means it's actually in league with America.
The logic isn't crystal clear.
No, not really.
All the time, right?
But they also point out, look, if America's obviously protecting the Houthis, because every time we, Al-Qaeda, go out and fight Houthis, we get droned. So it's droning us in order to protect the Houthis who are backed by Iran. So they're all on the same side.
Right. And one area where Al-Qaeda seems to be struggling is in its efforts to appeal to women.
That's right.
That offensive was actually discovered by you, I think. It has received a lot of attention recently because it's a bit weird and very interesting also that they're sort of taking this step in that direction. What do you make of that? Why are they trying to persuade women?
There has been, as you say, a bit of a push recently by Al-Qaeda to address women. And I don't think it's been working very well. It's pretty clear that the initiative is run and narrated by men. And what they've done, I think, is two things. One, they've tried to respond to Islamic State's slightly more empowering approach to women, which I think...
Using them in operations and stuff like
and I
that.
think that didn't used to be the case. Islamic State was also very against mixed genders on the battlefronts. But when you're under pressure, sometimes you have to bend your own rules a bit. So now, according to Islamic State, it's okay for women to support the jihad in any way possible. So that's taken to mean it's okay to take up a weapon now. Al-Qaeda, no, that's quite the opposite. They're saying, no, ladies, stay at home. You are most useful if you stay in the home. And they've brought out this new magazine. Yes, I broke that story called Beytuki.
Your Home.
Your Home, yes, right, Your Home. And this new magazine is pretty funny. If it weren't so serious, it would be funny. It has, for example, a problem page where one of the earliest problems was, my husband's a mujahid, my husband's a jihadist. He doesn't have any time for me. What should I do? And of course, the response is, you should stop moaning and be a support. Don't be an added stress for him. He sees blood and guts all day. And when he comes home, you should just be there behind the closed doors, making it a paradise on earth. So it's very male-oriented.
Different recipes to sort of please one's holy warrior or something like that.
You could call it that. And by the way, literally recipes. I think the recipes...
Mashed potatoes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. They had a recipe for, I call it jihadi mashed potato. Basically, this is, I think, perfect evidence that it's written by men. It basically says, boil the potatoes, mash them.
And also,
voila.
And also tips on how to do the washing up.
Yes, how can you do the washing up better? And the tips were, so the
hot water, right?
Yes, use hot water and start with the glasses. So it sounds like the kind of magazine that a few mujahideen on the run would probably have some ideas about how to, wash up and maybe make mashed potato or scrambled eggs.
Right.
But I'm not sure it's hitting its target female market in quite the way that it intends.
Right. And also a tricky question is, I mean, if a male militant gets 72 virgins in heaven, what's in the jihadi struggle for a woman? How can they sell that to the readers of this magazine?
The $60 million question, what's in it for the women in paradise? Well, that has actually been a question that came up. It didn't come up in the magazine, but it came up on the encrypted wire that the same group runs. So it was, ladies, here's the answer to your question. It actually said, nothing so exciting as you'll get 72 Chippendales in paradise, but it said that what you will get is that you will be prettier than the virgins and you will be of a higher social status. So that's it. That's what you get.
It's a hard sell, I suppose.
I think so. Yeah. And there was actually another question, which was on the wire, not in the magazine, which is, what do I do if my husband takes a second, third or fourth wife? And the answer, again, from a very male perspective, was, Well, don't get angry, don't be cross. Think about the advantages. You can share the housework with her. And another advantage, he might cheer up a bit, and therefore your life will be easier and more pleasant.
Right, right. And when you look at these different approaches to women that you described, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, does that tell us something about the direction of these terrorist networks in the future, do you think?
I think what it tells us is that Al-Qaeda is trying to keep and stick to its core principles. It's very gradualist. It does learn and it does adapt, but it has a very gradualist approach to society and to its idea, its concept of installing a caliphate ultimately. Whereas Islamic State, I feel, is now flailing around. It's okay, women take up weapons. Okay, actually don't come to the caliphate anymore. Why don't you just carry out your suicide operation in the West and target them there? It's almost like it's lashing out. I feel that Al-Qaeda has a slower approach. Mm.
And the symbolic role of women, it's not just an issue among militants. I mean, this has been at the heart of political and cultural developments in the Middle East for the last half century or so, with conservative backlashes in countries like Egypt, Iran, and so on. What do you think of that today, in the light of Islamic tradition and these botched projects of modernization, if you will?
I think your observation is right. I think there are many more, well, the external view of it would be many more veiled women in black.
Cairo.
In Cairo, even in Istanbul, actually, which we never used to see so much of. And I guess this is a backlash against failed modernization projects, but maybe also a way of expressing your keenness to adhere to religion as a solution, because when democracy seems to be failing, when you don't feel included in society, then you tend to think, oh, Islam's the answer. This is something that's played on very much by extremist groups. It's all of these woes would be gone if we just had Islamic ruling our country by Islamic law. Problem solved.
Sure. And your PhD thesis, it was actually on the Egyptian avant-garde in the post-war period, right? Yeah. When you had a time when the Arab world was looking more to the future than the past, and more to the West, perhaps, than the East. Are there any echoes left of that sort of progressive artistic movements today, as far as you can tell? And where are they in that case?
Yeah, so my original doctoral research was about the literary avant-garde in Egypt and how it was a way of expressing political movements, political currents, through poetry, short stories, novels. So I got very deeply into it. That kind of phenomenon is still around, because actually also it's a way of circumventing censorship. When you want to express controversial political opinion, you write it in literature, and you understand it, your reader understands it, but the government doesn't understand it. So it's a way of, again, shaping the future through literary work. But it's no longer coming out in the kind of magazine formats that I used to research. I think you find these in social media groups. And just one example of it would be the Arab uprisings, the so-called Arab Spring, because that generated a whole load of literature that wasn't so much about circumventing censorship, but it was about celebrating politics. The big question here is, does the literature influence the politics, or is it just the politics influencing the literature? That's something that I've written about, if you would wish to explore that further at some point.
It remains to be seen as well. I mean, in the region, it's like an open question.
Yes, very hard to quantify.
You mentioned social media. You have a very useful Twitter feed where you track developments in the jihadi movements and in Yemen in particular. When you spend so much time on social media, what do you make of the direction of these terrorist networks there, for instance, in their use of that kind of tools, now that they've been under such pressure recently?
Yes, I do think that the Twitter feeds and Facebook pages of terror groups are being closed down much more quickly.
Encrypted, and they use different
So now
channels.
they're using encrypted channels, and that's how I access mine. But I'm a bit of an addict, actually. I have about 50 encrypted social media channels, which I'm in.
You have to keep one step ahead of that sort of arms race in a way, then.
You do, because, well, I mean, so in my sense, staying ahead means keeping up with the groups, because you can't predict the list of letters and numbers that are going to enable you to penetrate that group. So you have to be invited or given the link. So you have to keep up with it in order not to fall off the radar. And I can't really say any more about that because I don't want to give away my sources.
Right.
But what we are seeing is that means that they're mostly now talking to themselves, inward facing. And
does that make them less efficient, do you think, or more dangerous?
I think it makes them less efficient. It makes them more dangerous in a certain way because it's more difficult to penetrate the groups and find out what's going on. But it does mean that they're not putting out vast amounts of material that's being picked up around the world by would-be jihadists who want.
It should hamper recruitment in European suburbs and so on.
It hampers that, yes. And there was actually a very prominent group called the Lone Mujahid, which was all about trying to promote lone wolf attacks. In fact, actually had promoted the Westminster attack before that happened. But that kind of material is disappearing almost within the hour. We have a lot of people working on that kind of thing.
And looking ahead now, what developments in the region should we pay attention to in particular, do you think?
I think looking ahead that sectarianism is going to become an increasing issue and that we should be trying to put pressure on various countries in the Arab world, in the Gulf, to try to damp down that rhetoric, because it can only lead to more conflict, such as the one we've currently seen in Yemen. And I think that the whole unravelling of the Iran deal is going to be very unhelpful to that boost in sectarianism. Another thing we might see is perhaps the rise of more radicalism and extremism amongst women. I sense that could be coming on. Now, there are some very positive developments too, born of unfortunate circumstances, which are women's empowerment. That often happens in conflict zones. But that could also turn in another direction. Women empowered might mean angry women who've lost husbands, sons, who's got family members who have been arbitrarily detained. We've already seen them appear in Al-Qaeda videos. So that, I think, is also one to watch. And
is it your feeling there that the women themselves are taking a step forward, or is this also driven by sort of a male agenda, if you will?
I think that the ordinary empowerment, not the extremist empowerment, is just driven purely by necessity, just as we saw in the Second World War here, or in the UK, that was very much about women having to enter the workforce and the labour market because the men weren't there. Yeah. So I'm just saying that kind of default empowerment could have another angle to it. And what we need to do is, I think, a lot more grassroots work inside women's groups.
Right.
To try to help direct their energies in positive ways that they would want.
Good idea. Thank you, Dr.
You're welcome.
Thanks.